Claire sat quietly at the round table in the bright hall. The room was full of music, laughter, and the sound of people talking. Golden lights shone from the chandeliers above, and the soft glow of candles danced across the tables. Everyone seemed happy and busy. Men and women in fine clothes moved about with smiles and cheer. Couples laughed, groups of friends told stories, and families stayed close together. Claire, however, sat alone with her hands resting on her lap. She had been invited to the wedding of a childhood friend. She wanted to come to celebrate, but she had known it would not be easy. She had no partner to bring with her and no close family nearby. She told herself that it was fine and that she would enjoy the evening. Still, as she sat at the table, the empty seat beside her made her feel smaller than she wanted to admit. The table before her was beautifully set. A white plate shone under the candlelight, and silver cutlery rested neatly on the sides. A folded napkin lay untouched. Around her, glasses clinked with the sound of wine being poured. She heard the clatter of forks and the sound of cheerful voices. The music from the band filled the air with warmth. Claire wished she could blend into the celebration, but her quiet presence only drew more notice. At a nearby table, two women glanced in her direction and whispered, their lips curved into small smiles that were not kind. One of them leaned closer to the other and spoke softly, yet loud enough for Claire to sense the tone. Claire's heart tightened, though she did not hear every word. She knew the subject of their whisper was her. Soon a faint laugh reached her ears from another corner. A man chuckled and nodded toward her side of the hall. Claire lowered her eyes to her plate, pretending to be busy with her fork, though she had not touched the food. Every whisper seemed to echo. Every laugh seemed sharper. She told herself not to care, but the weight of being alone at a wedding pressed down on her. She thought of leaving, of quietly slipping out and walking home under the night sky, but she stayed seated, trying to show strength even as her chest ached. The bride and groom moved across the room, glowing with joy. Claire smiled softly at them, truly happy for their union. She wanted to feel the same lightness they had. Instead, she felt like a shadow in the corner of a golden night. She shifted in her chair, straightened her back, and tried to take a sip of water from the glass before her. The cool taste gave her only a moment of calm. The laughter at another table rose again. This time it was clearer, and she caught a phrase about being alone. She felt her cheeks warm. The napkin in her hand twisted as she gripped it too tightly. The smile she forced onto her lips felt thin and fragile. Inside, she wanted to cry, but she held her head up and let her eyes focus on the dancing candles instead. In that hall, filled with life and joy, Claire was only one person, sitting by herself. Yet even as she felt the weight of every mocking glance, she did not leave. She stayed quiet and patient, not knowing that her night was about to change. Claire sat with her glass of water, trying to calm herself. Around her, the voices of the guests grew louder as the evening went on. The band played a cheerful tune, and the sound of clapping hands filled the room. Yet she felt distant, as if she were sitting behind a glass wall. She could hear everything, but she could not feel part of it. At the next table, a group of young men and women whispered to one another. Their eyes shifted in her direction. A woman in a red dress leaned forward and pointed slightly, covering her mouth with her hand. Another woman laughed and shook her head. Claire caught the quick glances, and though she tried not to react, her stomach turned. She reached for her fork, moved it against the plate, and pretended she was about to eat. The food on her plate was untouched, but she could not bring herself to take a bite. Her throat felt dry. She lifted her glass again and took another small sip, hoping it would hide the trembling in her hands. The laughter from the group grew louder, and this time, one of the men spoke in a voice that carried further. Claire could not catch the full sentence, but she heard the words sitting alone. The group chuckled at once, as if they shared a secret joke. Claire lowered her eyes quickly. A wave of shame swept through her. She wanted to be strong, but the sting of their words reached deep. She looked around the hall, hoping no one else had noticed. But she saw another pair of guests at a far table glance toward her, whispering softly with small smirks. It was as if her loneliness had become the evening's entertainment for those who had nothing better to talk about. Claire pressed her napkin in her lap, holding it tightly to keep her fingers steady. She wanted to disappear. Her heart beat fast in her chest, and she felt heat rise to her face. She thought of leaving again, imagining herself walking out into the cool night air where no one would look at her. but she also felt that leaving would mean she had let their mockery win. She was torn between the need to escape and the need to hold her place. The music changed to a slower tune. Couples began to move toward the dance floor. Men offered their hands to women, and the floor filled with graceful steps and soft laughter. Claire sat still and watched them. She wished someone would ask her, not out of pity but out of kindness. She wished she could share even one dance, but no one came. The empty seat beside her seemed louder than the music itself. Another laugh rang out, sharper this time. Claire heard a clear voice say, "She must be waiting for someone who will never come." Her chest tightened. She gripped her fork so firmly that it pressed into her palm. She wanted to cry, but she forced her eyes to stay dry. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She turned her gaze toward the candles on the table. Their flames flickered gently, steady against the draft of the hall. For a moment, she focused only on their light. She breathed slowly, telling herself that she was stronger than the whispers around her. But deep inside, she wished that someone, anyone, would stand beside her. She longed for a single moment where she would not feel like the only shadow in a room full of light. As the music continued and the laughter of others surrounded her, Claire sat alone, trying to hide her pain. What she did not know was that her silent strength was being noticed, and her night was on the edge of a change she could not yet imagine. The doors of the hall opened with a soft sound, and a new guest stepped inside. His name was Ethan. He was dressed in a neat gray suit, his tie resting perfectly against his shirt. He walked with calm steps, his eyes scanning the room. Most people did not notice him at first, too caught up in their dancing and laughter, but his eyes found Claire almost at once. She sat at her table, quiet, holding her glass of water with both hands. The light from the candles touched her face, and though she tried to appear strong, Ethan could see the loneliness in her expression. He noticed the way other guests looked at her and whispered. He saw the way some smiled at her pain, and his chest tightened with unease. Ethan did not know her, but something about her presence drew him closer. It was not pity that moved him, but a strange pull, as if he had been meant to walk into this hall at this very moment. The band played on, the guests moved across the floor, but for him the room seemed to narrow until there was only her at that table. Claire kept her eyes low, unaware of the man who had just entered. She pressed her fork gently against the plate, pretending to eat, though she had no appetite. The laughter from the nearby table reached her again, and she shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her heart sank a little deeper with every passing minute. Ethan walked past several tables, nodding politely to strangers who gave him quick glances. Some wondered who he was, for he did not seem to be close to the families. Yet he carried himself with ease, as if he belonged. His steps were steady, and his eyes never left Claire. As he drew closer, he caught the sound of mocking words from a group seated nearby. The laughter that followed made his jaw tighten. He could see Claire's shoulders stiffen at the sound, though she kept her face still. He admired the quiet strength she showed, sitting there with dignity, while others made her the subject of their talk. Ethan stopped for a moment, then moved forward with decision. He would not let the whispers continue without standing beside her. The hall was full of people, yet he felt as if his choice mattered only to her. Claire finally looked up as a shadow fell across her table. She blinked, surprised to see a tall figure standing there. Her first thought was confusion. She did not know this man, yet he looked at her as though they had met before. His eyes were steady, and his presence felt firm yet gentle. Ethan gave her a small smile. He rested one hand lightly on the back of her chair, leaning slightly toward her without invading her space. His voice was calm, but it carried clearly through the noise of the hall. "She's with me," he said. The words struck the air like a stone breaking the surface of water. Conversations paused. A few heads turned. The mocking voices that had filled the room only moments ago fell silent. Claire's breath caught. She looked up at him, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. She could only stare at him, her heart beating quickly. For the first time that evening, the heat on her face was not from shame, but from shock. Ethan stood firm, his gaze steady, as if daring anyone in the hall to question his words. The laughter that had once circled her faded into quiet, replaced by a curious stillness. Claire sat frozen, unsure of what to believe, yet feeling something stir inside her she had not felt in a long time. Her night had changed in a single moment, and she could sense it with every beat of her heart. The room grew quiet after Ethan spoke. For a moment the music and laughter seemed to fade. The guests who had been whispering about Claire exchanged surprised glances. Some tried to hide their reaction, while others stared openly. It was not only the words that struck them, but the way he said them. His voice had carried across the table with calm strength, and no one dared to laugh again. Claire's heart raced. She could feel her cheeks warm as she looked up at the man standing beside her. She had never seen him before, yet he acted as though he had always known her. Her mind filled with questions, but none of them reached her lips. She only sat there, frozen by his sudden claim. Ethan pulled the chair beside her and sat down. He moved with ease, as if the seat had been meant for him all along. His hand rested lightly on the table, close enough for her to notice, but not close enough to make her uncomfortable. He gave her a small smile, and his eyes held a steady kindness. "You should not sit here alone," he said softly, just for her to hear. Claire blinked, still unsure of what to say. The sound of voices began to rise again around them. People turned their attention back to the dance floor, but many still looked in their direction from time to time. The group that had mocked her grew quiet. One of the women in the red dress lowered her gaze and shifted in her seat. Another forced a smile as if trying to hide her embarrassment. The laughter that once stung Claire was gone. Claire finally spoke, her voice low. "Why did you say that?" Ethan looked at her calmly. "Because it was the truth in that moment," he replied. "And because no one deserves to be treated the way they treated you." She studied his face, trying to see if he was making fun of her. But his expression held no hint of mockery. Instead, there was a calm certainty that unsettled her and comforted her at the same time. The waiter passed by, placing a glass of wine in front of Ethan without a word, as if accepting his presence. Ethan lifted the glass politely, but did not drink. He kept his attention on Claire, not forcing conversation, but leaving space for her to respond. Her heart began to steady. She felt a strange sense of safety sitting beside him. For the first time that evening, she was not fighting to hold herself together. The whispers had stopped, the mocking eyes had turned away, and she no longer felt invisible. The music from the band filled the air again. Couples moved across the dance floor, their steps graceful in the golden light. Claire watched them, but her mind was on the man beside her. She wanted to ask who he was, why he had come to her table, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she allowed herself to sit quietly and feel the presence of someone who had chosen to stand with her. Ethan leaned slightly closer, his voice calm. "Do not let them take your evening from you. You came here to celebrate. Let it be your night as much as theirs." Claire looked at him with wide eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like that. The strength in his words filled the empty space she had carried for so long. Slowly, she nodded. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, small but real. The hall had not changed. The lights still shone, the music still played, the guests still laughed. But for Claire, the world inside the hall felt new. She was no longer alone. The evening moved forward, and the presence of Ethan by Claire's side began to change the way people looked at her. The tables that once filled with whispers now turned quiet. A few guests who had laughed earlier now pretended they had not noticed her at all. Others looked with curiosity, wondering about the man who had spoken with such certainty. Claire sat straighter in her chair. The shame that had weighed on her slowly began to lift. With Ethan near, she no longer felt like a shadow in the hall. She felt as if the light of the candles reached her in a way it had not before. She turned to him, still unsure of what words to use, but grateful for the comfort he gave her. They spoke in short sentences at first. Ethan asked if she had known many people at the wedding. Claire admitted she had come mostly out of respect for her childhood friend, the bride. She explained that she did not have family close by, and that she had been nervous to attend. Ethan listened carefully, his eyes never drifting away from her face. He nodded at her words, not to judge, but to show that he understood. When he spoke, his tone was gentle. He told her that he had not planned to come either. A colleague had mentioned the wedding and invited him at the last moment. He admitted he knew very few people there. Claire was surprised to hear this, for he carried himself with such ease. She thought perhaps he was used to standing alone, but in a way that looked strong rather than weak. The band shifted to another lively tune. Couples laughed and spun across the dance floor. The sound of clapping hands echoed through the hall. Ethan leaned closer and asked, "Would you like to dance?" Claire froze. She had not danced in years. Fear rose in her chest, and she shook her head quickly. "Cannot," she whispered. Ethan smiled faintly. "You can if you wish. But I will not ask again if it makes you uneasy." Her heart softened at his words. He had offered without pressure, and that made the thought less frightening. She hesitated, looking at the people moving gracefully across the floor. She imagined herself stumbling among them. Yet when she glanced back at Ethan, the calm in his eyes gave her courage she had not felt before. Slowly she nodded. He rose from his chair and offered his hand. Claire placed her fingers lightly against his palm. His hand was warm, steady, and she let him guide her toward the dance floor. The guests, nearby, turned their heads as they passed. Some watched in surprise, others in silence. Claire felt their eyes, but for once she did not shrink away. She focused only on Ethan, who led her gently to the edge of the floor. The music wrapped around them. Ethan placed his hand lightly on her back and she followed his steps. At first, she moved awkwardly, afraid of stumbling. But Ethan kept his pace calm, steady, guiding her without effort. With each step, her nerves faded. A small laugh escaped her lips as she realized she could do it. Ethan's smile widened at the sound of her laughter. "See," he said softly, "you belong here as much as anyone." For the first time that night, Claire felt free. She no longer noticed the whispers or the eyes that had mocked her before. The hall that once felt heavy now felt alive with possibility. The guests who had ridiculed her earlier sat in silence, watching the woman they had mocked move with grace beside the stranger who had claimed her. That the balance of the evening had shifted. Claire's heart lifted as she moved across the floor. She did not know where the night would lead, but she knew one thing with certainty. She was no longer alone. The dance floor glowed under the golden lights, and Claire moved with Ethan, as if she had always belonged there. Each step became easier, and the nervous weight in her chest slowly lifted. She felt lighter, as though the music itself carried her forward. Ethan guided her gently, his movements calm and sure. She followed without fear, and her laughter came more freely. Around them, other couples danced, but many eyes were drawn to Claire and Ethan. Guests whispered again, though the tone was no longer cruel. Instead of mockery, there was surprise and admiration. Some nodded quietly, impressed by the change they saw in her. Those who had laughed at her earlier now sat in silence, their smiles faded. Claire felt their stares, yet they no longer cut her. She lifted her chin and let herself meet their eyes. For the first time that evening, she did not feel small. She felt strong. She felt as if Ethan's hand on her back gave her courage she had not known she carried. The music slowed, and their steps matched the rhythm. Claire looked up at Ethan. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried warmth. She wanted to thank him, but the words seemed too simple. How could she explain what it meant for him to stand beside her in front of everyone? To take away the loneliness that had weighed on her all night. When the song ended, applause filled the hall. Claire and Ethan stepped back from the floor. She felt her heart race, not from nerves, but from joy. Ethan gave her a slight bow before leading her back to their table. People stepped aside to let them pass, their gazes following them with quiet respect. At the table, Claire sat down with a steady smile. The food before her no longer seemed heavy. She finally lifted her fork and tasted a small bite. It was simple, but it felt like a victory. Ethan watched her with a soft grin. "You see," he said, "you were never out of place here." Claire lowered her gaze with a smile. "I almost believed I was," she admitted. "Almost," Ethan replied, "but not anymore." The group that had mocked her earlier stayed quiet. One of the men shifted uncomfortably in his chair, as if ashamed of his words. The women avoided looking at her. Claire noticed this, but instead of bitterness, she felt a quiet triumph. She did not need revenge or harsh words. Her strength had spoken for itself. The bride passed by their table, her face glowing with happiness. She paused when she saw Claire and gave her a warm smile. "I'm glad you came," she said softly before moving on. Claire felt a sudden rush of warmth, as if the world itself was giving her a blessing. Ethan leaned closer. "They saw you tonight," he said. "Yo. Not the way they first did, but the way you truly are." Claire nodded slowly. His words touched her deeper than she expected. She had wanted to hide when the whispers began, but now she felt proud that she had stayed. She realized that it had not been only Ethan's presence that changed things. It had also been her own courage to remain in that hall when it would have been easier to walk away. The night moved on with music and laughter, but Claire no longer felt apart from it, as she felt part of the rhythm, part of the joy. The bond between her and Ethan was not built on long history, but on the power of a single moment. When he chose to stand beside her, she looked at him across the table, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She did not know what the future would bring, but she knew one truth. The night grew late, and the wedding celebration began to slow. The band played softer music, and the laughter of the guests became gentler as the hours passed. Candles on the tables burned low, their flames flickering quietly. Some guests said their goodbyes, while others lingered to enjoy the last moments of the evening. Claire sat beside Ethan, feeling a calm she had not known when the night began. The loneliness that once weighed on her had lifted, replaced by something warm and steady. She glanced around the hall and noticed how different it all felt. The same lights, the same voices, but to her they no longer carried judgment. She no longer felt like an outsider. Ethan looked at her and asked, "Would you like to step outside for some air?" Claire nodded, and together they rose from the table. As they walked across the hall, guests turned their heads to watch them. Some smiled politely, others simply followed them with their eyes. Claire felt no shame this time. She walked with steady steps, her hand brushing lightly against Ethan's arm as they reached the doors. The cool night air greeted them as they stepped outside. The sky stretched wide above, filled with stars.
Ouch.
The quiet outside was a gentle relief after the busy sound of the hall. Claire breathed deeply, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. For a moment, they stood side by side in silence. Claire looked at the stars, and Ethan watched her. He could see the change in her face. The worry that once clouded her eyes had softened, her lips curved into a small smile, peaceful and real. "You were brave tonight, Ethan," said quietly. Claire shook her head. "I do not feel brave." "But you stayed," Ethan replied. "That is where the strength was." She turned to him, her eyes meeting his. "And you came to me when I needed it most." "Why did you do it?" Ethan paused, as if searching for the right words. "Because I could not ignore what I saw. You deserved respect. You deserved someone to stand with you." Claire's heart stirred at his words. She felt a connection that was hard to explain, as if something unseen had drawn them together. It was more than chance. It was as if their paths were always meant to cross on this night. They walked slowly along the path outside the hall. The sound of crickets filled the air, and the glow of lanterns lit the garden. Claire felt safe beside him, as though each step they took together tied her closer to him. At the edge of the garden, they stopped. Claire looked back at the hall, remembering how she had first sat alone at her table, how the whispers and laughter had pierced her heart. She thought of the moment when Ethan appeared, his voice cutting through the noise with 4 simple words. "She's with me." Those words had changed everything. She faced him again, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you, Ethan. You gave me back more than an evening. You gave me back myself." Ethan smiled, his eyes warm. "Then it was worth every step I took toward you." The night air wrapped around them, quiet and gentle. Claire felt a certainty grow inside her. This was not just the end of a wedding night. It was the beginning of something new. She no longer feared being alone because she knew her path had crossed with his for a reason. As they stood under the stars, Claire and Ethan shared a silence that spoke more than words.
Ow.
Their hearts, once separate, now moved in rhythm. What began with laughter at her pain had ended with a bond that could not be broken.